Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. And today is a special live stream. I am joined by Dr. Bill Caraher, who I've known you, Bill, since what, 2007 maybe is when we met? Something
Probably
like that.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago, right? Back when I was not even a grad student. And I
Yeah.
think, what, you must have been just finished up or something like that? Or
Yeah. Oh, I think I was was I the Melanaki at the American school at the time? I think
Well,
I was
I didn't even know what the American school was at that point. I was working on the
oh,
Corfos Kalamianos project. But
yeah. I think I was on my way to be Melanaki that summer. And
okay.
and because Corfos Kalamianos is an offshoot of ECAS, right?
Yeah, that's
And
how I
I
met you.
worked
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I worked on ECAS starting in the late 90s. And so I would go down and visit Tom and Tom Tartarin and Dan Pullen and Amy Dill and like Lita and Tim Gregory were down there. And so like they were kind
Mm-hmm.
of my sort of my people.
Yeah, I consider
I
them
think
my
Richard
people too.
Rothfuss
Great
was down
people.
there too, right?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. I was working with
Richard was
Richard.
around.
Yeah, yeah. Because he brought up the DGPS unit. So I was in charge of all the GIS design for that
Right.
project in 2007, 2008. And so that's why Tom got me started talking with you and stuff like that. So yeah, so it's
That's
really
right.
good to
Yeah.
have you here. And we are here though not for a friendly conversation, okay? Because I have been public on my engagement with pseudoarchaeology since 2021, I guess, so about 4 years. And throughout it, Bill just keeps sending me like messages, and he's just like, dude, what are you doing? I'm a pseudoarchaeologist. And I'm like, Bill, you're a real archaeologist. You do real art. He's like, nope. So this is the one person in the world who is both a real archaeologist and a real pseudoarchaeologist. He is here to make a scholarly-ish archaeological defense of pseudoarchaeology, sort of. So you are now officially my enemy. How do you
Excellent.
feel about that, Bill?
I'm surprisingly calm.
Surprisingly calm. Okay. So before we get started with the sort of big guns, I did want to advertise Bill's blog. Bill is an old school blogger. And like, I've been reading his blog since before I met him back when I was an undergrad. And he's one of those people that did old school blog carnivals back in the early 2000s and all this kind of stuff. So wait a second, I wanted to share my screen. Got to do that. So his blog is called The Archaeology of the Mediterranean World, and it's always a good read. He has lots of good thoughts on a lot of archaeological topics, not just the Mediterranean world, but also pseudoarchaeology and other really important and fun topics. So please go check out, if you use an RSS feed or you read blogs, go check out The Archaeology of the Mediterranean World. This is Dr. Bill Caraher, and as you can see, he even was part of the Real Archaeology event, and during that he wrote a blog post called Real Pseudoarchaeology. So like, you know what, Bill, fuck you.
And
Like what?
you made the mistake of inviting me.
Hey, you invited yourself. You were like, we're gonna
I expressed interest. I was like, we'll see what happens.
Oh, thanks for putting that in the chat. Mediterraneanworld.wordpress. Okay, great. So yeah, what's your beef with the archaeologists that are out there debunking pseudoarchaeology? Tell us your beef. Let's get this show on the road.
All right. So, as probably anyone who's read my stuff knows, my beefs are lightly held and easily dissipated. But so I don't actually have a beef. I do enjoy. Okay, wait, I have a beef. Yes, I do enjoy the kind of the good-natured polemic that exists on social media, though. And things like that. I guess my greatest beef, my greatest concern is that I've been reading a lot of the anti-pseudo archaeology stuff, which is a bit of a mouthful, for I don't know, the last 5-7 years, and I find so much of it does a disservice to what we do as archaeologists. At the same moment that archaeology, right, is working to be bigger tent and for us to like expand our epistemologies, expand our ontologies, expand the people who we think are worth engaging with, right? Like the anti-pseudo-arch crowd seems intent on driving us back into the like pre-war, right? Or at least pre-1970s vision of archaeology, which is, you know, epistemologically, methodologically, and I would say even intellectually narrow, right? Which I think is counterproductive at this point. That if we've learned anything from the last, whatever, 10 years of the of people attacking pseudoscience, that debunking can only work as part of a much larger portfolio that includes engagement in lots of ways. And oftentimes engagement means things that we're uncomfortable with if we adhere to a narrow view of archaeology, because it means we got to meet these people where they are. And we have to kind of get away from this kind of reductive, these kind of reductionist arguments that do a disservice to both sides, right? Because it doesn't really represent the potential of pseudoarchaeology any better than it represents the potential of archaeology itself.
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a lot about this behind the scenes. And I mean, you know, I think Bill and me agree where we need to meet people where they're at. That's why I went on Joe Rogan, because there's so many people there that are listening to this kind of stuff that have an interest in archaeology, or pseudoarchaeology, as I'd put it. And so I think we need to go and do our best to engage the public. And I mean, you know, I've expressed in many times where I think that sometimes the drama can be a good thing because it'll actually get eyeballs on us. And I do my best, though of course it's hard. There's a lot of people out there that claim that I'm demeaning and arrogant, but like I try to say always that, like, look, I respect people and their different opinion, and you can believe whatever you want, but I'm sharing the evidence as I see it from the expertise and experience that I have, which is the best any of us can do. Now, my pushback on Bill is that my primary issue is that there's also bad actors out there. There are people out there that intentionally and willfully frame scientists and scholars and archaeologists as the enemy, as you know, trying to like hide the past and cover it up, and all this kind of jazz. They try to poison the well by making it look like we're trying to silence them, when none of us actually have any ability to silence any of them. They all have bigger platforms than us anyway, but that's their rhetoric and that's their narrative, because they are bad actors. They are not acting in good faith. They are intentionally misrepresenting us. And so that, to me, requires a little bit of a let's take off the gloves approach. You know, because if you're going to fuck with us and you're going to fuck with our excavations, like the kind of drama we see at Göbekli Tepe or the Serpent Mound and whatnot, you're endangering people that are scholars and archaeologists, and you're impacting how we manage and curate heritage and cultural heritage for the future. Well, you know what? Fuck you if you're just trying to profit off of these kind of bad ethics and bad activities. So this is where I think we have some disagreement, though I think we mostly agree. But yeah, go on. What do you think? Then what do we do when we are confronted with bad actors, man? What do we do?
I mean, I think this is the same thing we deal with. I mean, you've been in this business for a long time, and I mean, there's two things. First off, like both pseudoarchaeology and archaeology tend to traffic in what I think most of us call the ironic, you know, an ironic trope, right? Like the idea is that, I mean, archaeology is based on this kind of ironic understanding. That is to say, we excavate the surface to find the real meaning, right? And I think that both a part of the reason why that's so galling when we confront pseudoarchaeology in this mode, saying that, you know, institutions or individuals or sites are they're lying to us, is because we have effectively we felt like as scholars we had monopolized that view, right? Like we don't like it weaponized back against us. Like we're the ones finding true knowledge that's been hidden, whether it's hidden through formation processes or whether it's hidden through frankly, bad actors in our own discipline in the past, whether it's hidden through the opacity of traditions, or whether it's hidden through it's shoved in the back of a storeroom and overlooked for a century or 5 or 50 years or whatever, right? Like this is our job is to shine light in the shadows, right? And when pseudoarchaeologists turn that very same argument against us, we find this is particularly galling, right? Because wait, we can't be bad actors. And this is where we see this kind of lazy trope. this kind of lazy trope, which is like, we can't be bad actors because we're scientists.
Well, and that's obviously not true. There's lots of bad actors that are archaeologists. I've
Indeed.
called out some on this channel. I have a series of videos about the Homo naledi stuff. I actually hope in the nearest future to do another one that's in the wings. And then, I've called out other bad actors in the field. I hope to call out some bad actors that you and me know once I feel like I will have no repercussions. Because there's some bad actors in my past that have been very toxic and hurt some friends and colleagues of mine, as well as myself and my partner. And so, I've dealt with really nasty people in science. Scientists are not perfect either. So I think that that's important. And there's a vocal group of archaeologists, me and you included, who call out sexism and racism in the field on a regular sort of basis, other kinds of colonialisms and whatnot. And we should be working to improve the field. And I also think that the idea that archaeologists should monopolize stories about the past is a real problem. I do think, though, that managing heritage does require a certain level of experience and expertise, because you need to have that knowledge to be able to preserve heritage for the future. Like, it's not like some YouTuber can go somewhere and have a good idea, a solution for how to manage a large excavation when they've never done excavation or studied how things preserve and whatnot. But yeah, I think there's room to work with people. But I guess my point is it's not even the claims that they're uncovering stuff. It's the kind of vicious attacks and assaults on the field itself that I have an issue with. That's actually what got me started in this game. What I've found is most debunkers from the field, that is, they actually, when they were younger, they were pseudoarchaeology fans. And then they went to university and they saw the light. They saw that archaeologists had something there to say, and real evidence and whatnot. And then now what they do is they debunk because they're trying to pull people in the same direction that they were pulled, right? Me, I come at it from a very different perspective because my dad was an archaeologist. I've never been a fan of pseudoarchaeology. I mostly thought it was something to joke and crack jokes about, like, oh, people believe in aliens and junk like that, right? And so it wasn't until I really realized the ways in which pseudoarchaeologists poison the well in order to assault our field that I was like, we got to pay attention to this shit. This is like a full-on attack, and it's working. It's convincing millions of people out there. And like, that's a problem because that impacts how sites get managed. That impacts how excavations get run. That impacts how funding goes towards higher education and research and stuff like that. So that's when I started realizing I need to speak up, if you see what I mean. It was specifically that kind of polemic that they brought in our direction, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt, right? We can all agree, and I think you could get even some of the more vituperative, pseudo-archaeologists to agree with you that racism is bad, that like people being assholes to one another is bad. Like this is pretty low-hanging fruit here, right? That polemic wins eyeballs, right? That you know, our playfully pugilistic cover art for our little conversation was designed to make this seem like we're going to be at each other's throats. And we all know that polemic sells books, right? Like if you want to say that, yeah, what Flint Dibble says, that's really great. Like you're not even going to get, probably won't even get published in our fields, right? And selling books, even if we say that you're not going to make, you know, academic books can often make tens of dozens of dollars, right? They are avenues for career advancement. They're avenues for opportunities, for grant money, for whatever. So we can all kind of agree on that. We can agree probably that a pluralistic view of heritage management. Like I'm involved in heritage management in my community. My partner is effectively the heritage manager, if you will, for our town.
Okay.
And we recognize the value of having, as part of conversations, professional. I'm the archaeologist for on our city's historic preservation commission, for example, and occasionally, increasingly rarely, I'm asked to bring forward, some expertise that usually is pretty modest since I'm not an Americanist. But event like I contribute, what I know from my disciplinary background. But in order to make heritage management work, it means you also have to have all sorts of different voices in the room. We have a public commission that runs heritage management for our city that involves plenty of members who have no expertise beyond their interest, right? Or no professional expertise, or varying levels of professional expertise is probably the fairest way to put it. And we know that this is the way forward, right? That experts dictating what is important and what isn't important has a relatively modest success rate. You and I have worked in Greece long enough to be able to witness that on a daily basis, right? We've all read our Michael Herzfeld and books like that, right? Like, we know this stuff. This isn't even new to say it. The question then becomes, like, who do we accept into our tent? Who do we have on the commissions that make these decisions? And how do we recognize and how do we come to appreciate what they're saying? And how do we treat it not as just some peddler of a grift or someone who is attempting to tear down our modest little sandcastle that is disciplinary archaeology, and instead say, okay, like, how are you producing this knowledge? And how do I understand it in a way that's useful to us, right? That's useful to us, not as archaeologists wearing our like disciplinary hats, but as like members of the community, global community, local communities, whatever. How do we get there from here if so much of the public discourse is polemical?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's tough because I think we need to figure out. I think we need to figure out. Look, it's a tightrope. Academics are generally not very good at speaking to the public. We all know that is a challenge that we face. One of my goals in my career is to try to convince more of my colleagues to do more of it, to try to practice how you do that so that you get good at sort of presenting what we do in an interesting way that is also attention grabbing, because I think otherwise we're going to lose relevance in the public eye very drastically.
But I'd say that guys like you are pretty good at that. I think the harder challenge is how do we seed expertise, and how do we share expertise, right? Like, if you look at the real challenge for archaeology is when we walk into a room and people expect us to have the answers and to speak authoritatively. How do we encourage more voices to help us understand heritage, to help us understand disciplinarity, right? And I think the last 50 years, that's been the predominant debate in archaeology. It's not been how do we build, our picket and, defend our expertise, our authority. Like, it's not that. It's how do we open the doors to encourage more, whether they're indigenous voices, whether they're voices who are systematically or historically excluded, whether they're members of the community. This is why, like, public archaeology isn't about, me or you having a YouTube channel and telling people like the stories. It's about us. It's about you and me going out into the community and sitting and patiently listening to people. And I think that's what's beginning.
But I think there needs to be. I think there needs to be room for both.
But there's no question about there's no question that we have authority. Like, that's not being debated, right? The question is, how do we?
I disagree with you. Across the public that exists today, I think to me, I think I'm talking to somebody that's not recognized in the last 10 years of our history. Because I disagree with you. I think that our expertise and our authority is completely being challenged in the public world, in Trump's America, in various places around the world. I think expertise and authority are being effectively challenged and being effectively dismantled, because otherwise hundreds of archaeologists would not have been laid off in the last 2 months. Across the National Park Service, across various sort of federal government infrastructure areas. We have a live stream. We've chatted about this topic before. This is what's happening. Expertise is not being recognized. I actually think I disagree with you. I do think we need to defend our expertise. And I don't think it should be a fist fight type thing, but I think we need to get people to recognize why expertise and experience is valuable on these kind of questions. And what I tend to see is that when I talk with people in the general public, is a lot of people are interested in archaeology, but they also think that any old opinion is as valuable one way or the other, which can be true. Nobody's trying to say people cannot state their opinions. People can state their opinions all they want, but an opinion that's grounded in evidence is different than an opinion that is not. It just is, because, and that's why when I sat down and talked with Hancock, it showed up pretty clearly for most people that my opinion was grounded in far more evidence than his was. And so, I think we need the opportunity to demonstrate our experience and expertise. And in fact, I would argue that our colleagues, we need to reframe how we speak to the public, because we need to stop thinking that the public is going to accept our expertise and experience. And instead, we need to do a better job of convincing them. I'd say it's just like teaching a classroom of students. When you start teaching an intro level class, if you just assume that those students are going to respect you and you start acting like an arrogant ass to them, they're going to quickly not respect you. You need to earn their respect, and we need to learn how to earn the respect of the public and not just expect it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I think there's a lot going on in what you've just said, and I think some of it is some of it's spot on. Some of it is probably more complicated than we have time to get into, and some of it is a question of means as opposed to ends, right? Like, yeah, obviously there's some situations where archaeologists need to be proactive to protect, for example, sites from development, but I would argue that most of the most dangerous threats to our expertise as archaeologists aren't coming from the communities where pseudoarchaeology has a lot of play. Like, we're attacking the wrong people. It's coming from the belly of the beast. It's coming from what they famously called the military industrial university complex, right? It's in fact coming from the very traditions in which we operate in, which is the traditions of modernity, right? It's not coming from, like, okay, we may say Graham Hancock is emboldening, someone to think differently and to not listen to your authority, but okay, fine. Like, that's not the basis for the destruction of ancient sites. That's not the basis for the destruction of heritage. It's not because they think aliens built this shit. It's not because of that. They're laying off archaeologists, and they're laying off, and they're endangering sites because of capitalism. Like, that's all it is. Yes. And I don't think,
but
and I think actually one of the great strains of counter-capitalist thinking comes from pseudoarchaeology. In fact, I would argue pseudoarchaeology has much firmer roots in anti-capitalist traditions than traditional archaeology does, which is coming where? From the nation state, from the military, from industrial modes of production, from the university.
See, I disagree. Because I think most pseudoarchaeologists are just do it to make money, and they make a lot of money. And so, when you see this kind of stuff, they're making a lot of money. They're doing it to get clicks, to sell books, to do all these kind of things. And I also disagree because I regularly, and I've been researching this, I can document dozens and dozens of examples of pseudoarchaeology harming sites. They regularly put on YouTube or publish or encourage the private market, which involves looting or forgeries. They regularly go and trespass on archaeological sites, breaking the law in all sorts of countries around the world because they think they have a right to get some footage for their fucking YouTube channel or whatever. And so, I think that what they're promoting actually is actively harmful to archaeological heritage.
It's a matter of scale. It's a matter of scale, man. Like, yeah, sure. Individuals pepped up on the pseudoarchaeology may do damage to the site. I would argue that archaeologists pepped up on academic archaeology have also been every bit as guilty about trespassing on sites. In fact, we know this historically. In fact, the entire idea of NAGPRA is in order to counteract that. So if we're thinking about like damage to sites, like, go and look at the Smithsonian. They have tens of thousands of ancestors that have been looted, not by pseudoarchaeologists, but by people with disciplinary credentials. Go to places like the University of California. Go to places like.
But why should we not call out both?
I'm
Bill?
agreeing
why
to call out both. I'm agreeing with that. But I think the thing that we have to think about is scale, right? That the average, casual pseudoarchaeologist who's swinging the metal detector around looking for, whatever Roman coins in upstate New York, like, is a lot less likely to be damaging to a site than the systematic looting of indigenous sites conducted by disciplinary archaeology. And why is disciplinary archaeology doing that type of thing? Well, it's easy, because disciplinary archaeology has long roots, has deep roots in the nation state, have deep roots in capitalism, have deep roots in exploitative practices. And pseudoarchaeology can mimic that. But if you look at the long history of the discipline, like, let's take everyone's favorite whipping boy, a cat like Ignatius Donnelly. Like, you think Ignatius Donnelly was doing, first off, he was doing it to make money. There is no doubt. But do you think his ultimate goal was to, like, somehow, like, I mean, like, the dude is one of the, like, heroes, right, of, like, 19th century alternative science. We can say his ideas are bunk. That's not a problem. But we cannot question his motives. And his motives were not simply to make money. If he wanted to make money, he could have easily done any number of more monetarily, lucrative tasks. Like, the dude was a radical Republican. The dude was a radical progressive. The dude was railing not only against the university establishment, which probably has gotten many of our colleagues' goats, right? Like, there's recent books that celebrate this misrepresentation of Ignatius Donnelly, almost making his radical republicanism of the late 19th century into a kind of a predecessor of radical republicanism in the early 21st century, which is just horrific to anyone who knows anything about the progressive tradition in the Northern Plains. As an aside, like, some of these patron saints of pseudo-arch I'd be far more inclined to have on my side on the pickets or to have a beer with than some of the early archaeologists who are obviously and completely enthralled to things like the nation state and capital. And I think that shows, right?
I mean, I tend to think Ignatius Donnelly was as well. But,
this is a dude who railed against capital his entire career. He died in poverty.
Yeah,
he died in poverty. Like,
well, and he exploited a lot of people to get wealthy.
He was never wealthy. When was he ever wealthy? His entire.
What do you mean? He was like,
he was a failed farmer.
He was extremely wealthy in the middle of his career. He ended up being a senator and a successful businessman.
Yeah, but he was not extremely wealthy, man. He was propped up by, like, the farm labor movement out here in the Northern Plains, and, like, these were not wealthy cats. These are cats pushing back against guys like James J. Hill, who is manipulating, right? Who is manipulating markets in ways that damage the ability of not only labor but ag to make a buck. So, if anything, like, his fascination with things like Atlantis, to take as an example, was not only an attack, I would argue, on universities, which he saw quite rightly in the late 19th century as bastions of elitism, right? But also part of his, like, larger project of this fantasy of radical transformation of society, right? Of the destruction of everything in order to rebuild society on more just grounds. Like, that seems noble to me. We can agree to disagree. He and I could have disagreed.
I mean, I tend to think he was just as biased and problematic as anybody from the 19th century.
What does that even mean?
He had a whole string of.
He was just as biased.
Well, it means that. Well, I mean exactly what I said. If you read what he's written, he has all sorts of fucking issues with prejudice towards different groups of people. And so, he's celebrated as somebody who's abolitionist.
He's disappointed about both sides. I'll stop. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to. I'm trying not to be both sidesy here. My point is actually.
But I don't think our goal here is.
Go on.
But I think also that you talk about the scale of these problems, and I agree with you. Look, when it comes to archaeology, pseudoarchaeology is a small drop in the bucket. Without a doubt, it does not have enough sway on what is actually done archaeologically, though I worry that sway is growing as it becomes more popular in today's world. But what I do see is that more of our colleagues are actually out there calling out injustices in the field than are out there actively calling out pseudoarchaeology anyway. So I actually think that
agree.
the discipline is on the same side anyway. It's a very small number of archaeologists that actually call out pseudoarchaeology. And so to bring up, well, oh, it's a less of a scale of an issue than the other types of injustices like the colonialism that exists in the field or the other problems in the field. Well, okay, but a lot less effort is going into tackling it
Fair
anyway.
enough.
So maybe the priorities are all okay. So let's get back to what your issue is. Why the hell do you call yourself a real pseudoarchaeologist?
In part because I'm increasingly convinced that the ideas that come out of pseudoarchaeology. Okay, so wait a sec. Jason Calvavito's book on Donnelly argues he'd been rich but lost most of his money in the Panic of 1857.
So we're both right.
Yeah,
but
the larger point was
1857
is much before his book on Atlantis. Like he's writing those books like from a position of weakness, not a position of, he is not the
well, he was a successful politician as well. I mean, from my understanding of his career, he had a lot of ups and downs. He was just a wild figure where he made a bunch of money at times, he lost a bunch of money at times. He made a bunch of money at times, he lost a bunch. Am I frozen? I'm frozen. 1 second.
Ooh, is this my chance? Can I jump in? No,
yeah,
I'm just messing with you. I guess my point of pseudoarchaeology and why my inclination is to give pseudoarchaeology more credit than perhaps some of my more debunk happy colleagues is because I think we can actually learn a lot from the reception of pseudoarchaeology among different communities over the last however many, 100 and some odd years, right? And that I think that by listening to the communities who take pseudoarchaeology seriously, we can find places that the places where archaeologists and pseudoarchaeologists, or archaeologists and our larger constituents, maybe we say, most of us are in some ways operating in the public sphere. Like what we do is operating in for the public good in some ways, where we can form the basis for those conversations. And actually, I think that pseudoarchaeology over the last 80 years, 90 years was pushing on things that we only now as archaeologists are beginning to take seriously, in large part because pseudoarchaeology became a vehicle for groups that had been systematically excluded from the discipline to articulate their anxieties, whether those are anxieties of globalization, whether they're anxieties of catastrophic collapse, whether they're anxieties about migration, whether they're anxieties about race. And those are things that really within our discipline have only kind of become fascinating since the mass democratization of archaeology, which is still obviously a work in progress, in the last, 40 years, like 50 years. And we can say that some of the stuff, and look, from an epistemological standpoint, man, it takes a certain amount of stamina to sit there and this, right? To read the pseudo-arch stuff, right? Like some of it is you have to suspend a lot of disbelief. But look, man, I've been in the business of archaeology for 25 years, and I'm actually finding that it takes me not as much energy to suspend disbelief reading pseudoarchaeology as it's taken me to suspend disbelief when I'm sitting in an academic conference and hearing a paper on, fingernails and Hellenistic sculpture and wondering if this person has any contact with like the larger state of the world, right? Whether these people have any idea what the fuck is going on. Whereas, man, a lot of these pseudo-arch dudes, like guys, like, okay, we can even pull up Ignatius Donnelly. Like, Donnelly was fucking right. Like, when he's writing about, like, the dangers of capital, when he's talking about the dangers of guys like James J. Hill, like, he's not wrong. When he talks about the dangers of racial prejudice, when he's like, man, we cannot allow them to take the rights from Black people. And when he's pushing against Jim Crow, like, Donnelly's right? Like, he was there. Whereas what are archaeologists doing? Like, we weren't doing that. Like, I can tell you there were...
You're giving Donnelly a lot of credit in my mind.
I'm using Donnelly as like a gentle example. He's someone we can both agree was like a good dude, right?
sometimes he has a lot of nasty things he said about various groups of people, particularly indigenous groups in the
Absolutely.
Americas. He has a lot of really nasty things he said about them, which makes sense living in the
19th
Midwest in the
century,
middle of the
the
19th
late 19th
century.
century, absolutely.
But you can't just excuse him because he lived in the 19th century, though, for saying those kind
No,
of
but
things. You're giving him credit,
but we can
like,
read him in context, right?
you know.
Like an archaeologist.
Well,
We can
okay,
be
we can
aware of
definitely
his
read him in
of his
context.
context, and to say that like he was speaking.
Okay, but if you're going to praise him, we can critique him as well,
No,
right? And so we should be doing
look,
both.
John Apple told us that we were both sidesisming, so we have to be aware of that. Like, we cannot both sides.
John Apple's one of my channel members and
I
patrons,
understand,
so he's a
but,
good
but we
dude.
can't, like, we don't, particularly we don't want to piss him off because if you don't keep the patrons happy, then ain't nobody happy, right?
John, don't go. Come on.
I said I was going to stop both sizing.
Yeah, well, but so okay. But
so Dante Peacemaker
let's
actually
think about
asked
a
an
different
important
topic.
question. He says, "What is the point of all this?" And the point I'm having, the point I'm really trying. That's awesome, man. The point I'm trying to make here is that like we can learn from pseudoarchaeology because pseudoarchaeology has been involved in some of these conversations that are of utmost significance to not just archaeologists today, but of like people alive in the world today, right? If we accept,
give me an example. Give me an example. What can we learn from
catastrophic collapse is the easiest one, right? Like, why has there been a fixation on Atlantis? And it's not because these people think Atlantis is in their bathtub or whatever. That's fine. They might think it's in their bathtub. They might not. But why are they fascinated by it? Because they're fascinated about the prospects of catastrophic collapse, right? And they say, how and why does it happen? It's not surprising that most of these people say it happens because Atlantis was actually really fucked up. They said Atlantis isn't this kind of utopian community. It's a community that is fucked up, right? That sides disagree with one another. And that like these disagreements, right? They're factions. Usually these factions map loosely on to those who control capital and those who are forced to labor, right? Like oftentimes, or the idealistic and the practical, right? So this is a model. This is a model that they're attempting to use to understand contemporary society, and on which they project their anxieties, right? If you want to understand these kind of anxieties, like why are we so fascinated now? Why is there like a book a week that comes out?
Why are you giving so much credit to the pseudoarchaeologists for this? As far as I know, every single conference I've been to, especially I participate in a ton of workshops and conferences, and I've organized and published on collapse of societies and climate change and these kind of anxieties as well. So why do the pseudo-archaeologists get credit for this in your mind when we're doing this as well?
I was going to say that not a week goes by without a book on climate change and coming out from disciplinary archaeology. But one of the things that struck me is that, archaeologists don't read a lot of pseudo-archaeology. You're an obvious exception. You're an exception, right? I like to think I'm an exception. And if we don't read it and we don't take it seriously, then we can't.
Andrew Kinkella says.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
This is our host of the pseudo-archaeology podcast, by the way.
I can tell. I can tell him this that if you're going to be a serious archaeologist, you also waste a tremendous time. To waste a tremendous time of time and money, or you waste a tremendous amount of time and money as a real archaeologist too. Like how many things have I wasted entire summers or multiple summers on that end up not being actually productive or produce any sort of new knowledge? Like, yeah, come on, man, we're academics. This is the big thing. So anyway, I would say a catastrophic collapse. Like we have a corpus of material that is engaged in this stuff, that is engaged with it not from the perspective that traditional archaeology has been engaged with it from. And in fact, this is very consistent with archaeological interests, right? Like this is how come we're listening more carefully to indigenous voices as an example, right? We know indigenous epistemologies aren't the same as ours. We know this means that that a simplistic relationship between argument and evidence is not something that is likely to convince an indigenous archaeologist necessarily of the integrity of an argument, and that we've learned to respect that. not because
Yes.
we think we're right and we think they're wrong, or they're right and we're wrong, but because we allow for pluralism to exist. And we know that really when you scratch archaeology, as you know, cats like Alison Wiley have taught us many years ago, when you scratch an archaeologist, you're not going to find the kind of epistemological integrity as you know, some of the more heartfelt books on archaeology has suggested exists. So reading more broadly and
I mean, but
reading into
that's
some of
true
these,
across all of academics and scholarship.
we're
I
not
mean,
doing both
like,
sides. We are not doing both sidesism, Flint.
but look, man,
We are
I
not
want to
doing both.
know. I want the let's fight then. What is your problem with debunking? Should we not be sharing our perspective with the public?
All right, I have 3 problems with debunking. Most of it is simplistic and reductionist, and it turns archaeology into this kind of narrow epistemology, right? Because we have to debunk using the science, and I think that's a mistake. I think that sells archaeology short. Yeah, what are you drinking?
Leffe Blonde. I've had a hell of a week, guys. Sorry that I'm drinking them on the live stream, though. I do it on some of them. It is
I
8
would.
p.m.
It's
here
2:30 here.
on a
I'm drinking
Friday.
tea. I
It's
know I
8
should be
p.m. on a
drinking tea.
Friday here, so you know
You're
I can
totally
drink whatever the hell I
justified to
want.
drink.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like, this is still a
Sorry,
work day in
sorry.
North
So
Dakota.
it's reductive.
It's reductive. Secondly, it reinforces the exclusion of certain voices from the discipline who have been traditionally excluded from the discipline, right? That all we're doing is doubling down on exclusionary practices.
Like a bunch of white dudes.
It's not. I've argued, as you know, in my stuff, that a lot of pseudoarchaeology, a lot of pseudoarchaeological ideas were consumed by African Americans, for example, by Black people. And that these people consumed this stuff not because they didn't know better, but because they were systematically excluded from the discipline. That there
But
aren't.
why should we not be promoting an education along the lines that we give to our students in our university classrooms? Why should we not be sharing our knowledge widely with the public for those who are interested in listening? Like in many,
I think we should, man. I just think debunking is a kind of doubling down on practices of systematic exclusion that existed in the past, and that we shouldn't.
But you agreed with me earlier that engaging in a dramatic way can draw eyeballs and get people interested in what we do. Debunking is exactly that. It's upping the drama in order to get more eyeballs on what we do, to be able to teach what we do for those who are willing to listen. So
there's a difference between there's difference between a playfully pugilistic podcast. Look at that alliteration, and academic books that are advocating for the same simplistic. And you know, we both read one within the last couple of years that you know, kind of traded in the like laziest anti-pseudo-archaeological tropes. That was, and this was written by an academic, published to an academic publisher, that wasn't going to appear which isn't a podcast, isn't, you know, me and you. Like, part of the reason I engage with you, Flint, is because I use your notoriety to advance some of my ideas, right? Like, yeah. And the same reason why you went on Rogan isn't Joe Rogan, is because you're going to use Graham Hancock. Like, no one went on Joe Rogan to hear Flint Dibble. Like, okay, maybe the 14 patrons or whatever you have, with all due respect, John, or whatever, they went on to hear Graham Hancock, right? Like, this is like I have no problem with us.
Sorry, Bill is gone now. He is sitting there and he's insulting my patrons. So we're just going to tune him out for about 30 seconds. He's going to be in a timeout. So Bill, I want you to consider what you're saying. You do not insult the people that help support my channel, because you are here at because of my privilege is why you are here.
Well,
okay.
fair enough. Look, man, I was the one arguing against both sidesism. I was also supporting their perspectives. Anyway, my larger point is that people went on Rogan to hear like Graham Hancock as much as you, with all due respect, right? Like, you know, so I'm all for, and yeah, like I play with you and John Hoops and these guys in part because I see this as an opportunity to amplify what I'm saying, and I'm not really worried about that. Like, I think playful kind of engagement on social media and on channels like this shows a little bit how the sausage is made, right? This is witnessing the kind of give and take and ebb and flow of ideas. What my concern is is when you begin to read this kind of trickling up, as it were, into academic books and master's theses and dissertations, and you begin to recognize that these ideas, if not countered intellectually, academically, can have a deleterious effect to the discipline, because it's trying to run counter to the last 50 years of archaeological work, which has been not to tell people they're wrong, but is to figure out how to create more pluralistic forms of knowledge, right?
Yeah, so I need to think on this, because I mean, look, we've had a lot of conversations about this. I'm going to pull up Andrew Kinkella again, where he says he just learned his podcast is exclusionary and reductionist. So not everybody.
No, I've never listened to your
Bill.
podcast, man. I'm just saying.
He has the pseudo. He hosts the Pseudoarchaeology podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. You got to get Andrew
have me on. You should have me on. Am I doing it right?
And so, okay. I think there's a difference here, because I think sometimes I think your ideas are right, but I think also at times you miss the forest for the trees. So let's give an example of one of our colleagues who teaches in an anthropology department, who I think that you, me, Andrew Kinkella, and others are going to agree is extremely exclusionary and reductionist. This is Elizabeth Weiss. She has written about how she should have the rights to do any experiment necessary on indigenous remains, and she thinks that NAGPRA is in support of indigenous religion and anti-science, right? But what I find interesting is, if you go on social media, who are the people boosting Elizabeth Weiss? Pseudoarchaeologists. She's married to a pseudoarchaeologist who is on Ancient Aliens regularly. The people like Jimmy Corsetti and Dan Richards and Sam Urban, they're the ones that are boosting her on social media. She's the one publishing in Quillette and like other types of places. And so, I actually tend to think that, like, we try to focus the best we can on the versions of pseudoarchaeology that are exclusionary and that actually overlap oftentimes with these way outdated versions of our own field. And so I get you. I think that thinking through a more nuanced approach towards, say, indigenous perspectives, African American perspectives, and stuff like that on archaeology and heritage, and even what we would call pseudoarchaeology, is something we need to do. One of my big problems on the fraudulent Facebook wall of shame, which I participate in regularly, is they're sometimes nuts about calling out Afrocentrism, for example, even when some of these ideas that have been called out as Afrocentric actually have real evidence for them, because in the 90s, they were considered Afrocentric. Things like the Black Athena and stuff like that, which we now know, so much of Greek culture and Roman culture does come from Africa and the Near East and elsewhere, from non-European areas. And so, it's like, but so many skeptics, scientific skeptics, they have an outdated view of this kind of stuff, even though we've now learned to embrace more of the stuff because it is grounded in evidence. And so how do we look? It's a complicated world, is the reality. And so how to approach it is tough. And I think at times we do need to think through how I think your critique is like, well, these academic books are a little too simplistic. It's okay being a little simplistic with the public, but I don't know. Do you want to talk about some of maybe Sun Ra or some of these more from marginalized communities, how they might be approaching pseudoarchaeology and how we could try to embrace that and learn from it and promote it, or what?
Yeah, I think that's a good example, right? Is that people is like, let's look at some of these characters who took pseudoarchaeological ideas and used them in ways that aren't reinforcing racist tropes, that aren't for exclusively for the grift, right? Everyone has to make a buck somehow, so I'm a little loath to declare everything I don't like a grift and everything that I do like as noble efforts on the part of the community, but whatever. Or like art, artists deserve to be paid. And so like I'm working on a little anti-pseudo-arch book. And I don't know if I'll ever have the time or bandwidth to publish it. The problem with real archaeology, as you know, Flint, is it expands to fill all the time that one has available. But nevertheless, and one yeah, one of the patron saints of this in my book, one of the heroes is this guy Sun Ra, right? And Sun Ra, for people who don't know, is an avant-garde musician, jazz musician, and he melds basically Afrocentrism to Afrofuturism, right? He's one of the fathers of Afrofuturism. So he's interested, as his name would suggest, in kind of Egyptianizing, a kind of mid-century Orientalizing. Sun Ra died in the 20th century, right? He's a his great era of Florowit was from like the 50s to the 70s. I think he lived into the 90s, but his most productive years were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He combined these kind of outrageous stage shows with futuristic musical instruments, and if you look at his Atlantis album, for example, it is shot through with pseudoarchaeological track names. And lest we think this is just him pulling things out of the kind of public ether, we know what Sun Ra's library looks like, just because because parts of it at least have been published. And when we look at his library, it is the greatest hits. It is the greatest hits of pseudoarchaeology. In fact, when he went and taught a class at Cal, he included on his reading list some of these greatest hits, right? He included people like Blavatsky and Opalesky and on some of these guys who we all can more or less agree are deeply problematic thinkers. Now, I don't want to go so far to suggest that Sun Ra isn't problematic as a thinker. I suggest he is not ethically or morally problematic. I think he's just problematic because it's really hard to understand what the hell he's talking about. Which is a little bit
true for a lot of pseudoscience, but you know,
I think it's true of a lot. I mean, it's true for a lot of science I've discovered too. Yeah, like I've read plenty of archaeology papers, which I'm like, I have no idea, man. I guess this is probably right.
I've read some of yours, and I'm thinking that, man.
Hey, we're all guilty of this at some point, right? So, in any event, he's basically reading pseudoarchaeology, right? He's reading guys like Edgar Cayce. He's reading guys like Blavatsky. He's reading, even he's reading Ignatius Donnelly, right? And he takes these ideas and says, like, how do these speak to the African American situation in the late 1950s, in the 1950s and 1960s? This speaks to our kind of alienation, right? The separation from Africa as a result of the Middle Passage is actually not fundamentally, in Sun Ra's mind, different from the possibility of ancient cultures being promulgated by ancient aliens. It is a literal form of alienation, of separation from this kind of ineffable or ununderstandable, or this is the Cold War, man. This is the space race. This kind of extraterrestrial high-tech past, right? And like this is very consistent with like contemporary scholars who are saying, actually, like Africans knew how to do a lot of really cool shit, right? And whether this is materialized in things like Black Panther, right, and sort of turned into kind of these moralizing mass media extravaganzas, or whether this is coming out through more sober-minded science. Sun Ra is basically exploring these same ideas. Now, we can say that the idea that the pyramids were built by aliens from outer space is problematic on racial grounds. It's more difficult to untangle how we deal with the idea that all Black people are aliens. Like, of course, we can come at this with a sober-minded scientific approach. I'm not arguing against that. But it shows how a pseudoscience idea, a pseudoarchaeology idea, can be manipulated to articulate a particular condition in which African Americans were existing, right? Which is a situation of radical, again, I'm very proud of my pun, alienation, right? And this is why some of these cats, become popular, right? Because they're speaking to, the trauma of the Middle Passage. And, lest we think it's just this eccentric dude, I like to call him a modern Pinocchio for those fans of Carlo Ginzburg. This is a similar thing that's being played out in Moorish science, right? If you've read any of Moorish science work, like you see exactly some of these similar arguments, right? If you read Nation of Islam, right? If you read stuff like Louis Farrakhan's latest or last 30 years of discussion, man, some of the same kind of stuff is coming up. Now, Obviously, more science does not think of themselves as aliens, nor does Louis Farrakhan. But, you know, these themes of extraterrestrials, these themes of alienation, these themes of Afrocentrism, these themes of explaining migrations that we now are almost willing to accept are part and parcel not only with the dawn of the modern age, right? This goes back to Du Bois, but also the dawn of capitalism, right? That the Middle Passage is the moment in which the modern world is imagined. And they're trying to turn this shit on its ear. And they're doing it. And they're doing it in ways
I got a question
that...
for you.
All right.
So I think this is valuable. I mean, look, a lot of the critique of pseudoarchaeology, as you've always said, is biased in a sense where we focus on only one type of pseudoarchaeology, a type that has these roots in colonialism and white supremacy and whatnot from the 19th century that gets carried on now. But what we ignore is that obviously pseudoarchaeology itself is much more pluralistic, meaning these people might not be reading Ignatius. Well, I guess they did a little bit, but like,
they are reading Ignatius Donnelly. They are.
Yeah.
That's the thing that blows your mind, right?
But
they're reading these same works and not turning into mini Führers. They're not turning into white supremacists. They're turning into civil rights activists. They're turning into Malcolm X. Like, that breaks one of the great counter arguments against pseudoarchaeology, which is like little Bobby is reading his Von Daniken and then wakes up one morning like doing like Sig Heil.
I don't think anybody, certainly I have never claimed that anybody just all of a sudden starts reading this stuff and becomes a racist.
No, but I'm not, again, I'm oversimplifying.
There are obviously some people that do oversimplify this kind of stuff. But at the same time, you know, there is very clearly, if you go look at some pseudoarchaeologists online, you can see that their following has a lot of actual overt fucking racism, anti-Semitism.
There's no doubt. Like, we can all agree that we hate racists. Like, there's no problem with that, right? Like, and I'm not trying to make
and we should be targeting those racists and
I'm with you,
attacking them, and we should be targeting those that maybe aren't overt racists, but provide harbor for large groups of racists, because that's a problem as well.
I'm comfortable with that until the point where it begins messing with our discipline, in which case then we have to look at the difficult past of like why people are doing DNA analysis and shit like that.
Sure, but we can be nuanced about this and call out people in our discipline that are bad actors and call out people in pseudoarchaeology that are bad actors, right? We should be calling out bad actors,
no matter what.
Broad brush, whatever. Like, you know, like most fans of pseudoarchaeology, I have zero problem with, unless they display some level of racism. On the other hand, some of the purveyors of pseudoarchaeology that are like sending people my way, putting my name in fucking brackets and calling me a Jew, all this kind of shit. Screw you. You're an asshole anti-Semite, right? You know, like that's just how it is.
I'm with you.
But let's get back to where we were, because we were with.
But that's not the direction I was going. Yeah.
That's not the direction you're going. I want to get back. I was trying to ask a question. Sorry, I've had 2 shots and half a beer. Clearly, you know, I've had a bad week. All right, you know, like, seriously. So, what I'm trying to say is, I see my role, and I think that some people see their roles when they speak to the public as trying to share the same kind of thoughts and attitudes and experiences and expertises that I would share with my students, right? But I want to share it mostly for free. Obviously, please sign up to become a patron or a channel member. You get a few extra perks, but most of what I do is for the public. It's free. But when we think about stuff like Sun Ra or marginalized communities where they also have a pluralistic view of pseudoarchaeology, should we also not be trying to reach those communities with our own experience and expertise? Should we not be giving them, as best we can, access to free education?
Dude, you're talking to me, man. Like, I'm an open access publisher. Like, I've published 50 books, you know, from my open access press over the last 10 years, right?
University of North Dakota.
Yeah, the digital press at the University of North Dakota. Just this week, we published a book on the archaeology, an archaeology of the Red River of the North, right? Which is the river valley, the ancient lake bed, Lake Agassiz lake bed, right? So like, I'm with you, man. Like, I agree. I think the reason I engage with people on social media, the reason why I publish at Open Access Press, the reason why I'm like a champion of open access with the professional organizations that I'm members of, is because I think that we should try to meet them. My problem isn't so much that we that we aren't. I mean, obviously, I think it's important, and there are many things we can do to reach out to these communities. I think an important component of that is listening to these communities and attempting to understand how they see the world. And this is where I think some of our anti-pseudo-archaeology rhetoric can get in our way, right? Because I think we're trying to do the right thing, which is to say racists and grifters are terrible. But I think that like almost everyone can agree with that. Like even horrible racists would say, you know what's who really suck? Racists. You're like, oh God, right?
We've seen some of that recently on social media where some of these racists are attacking other racists.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. This is, and even nonsense like white race, like what is white racism? Like the hell? So, but we can all agree on that, right? What I'm trying to get us to do is to say, like, what is the long tail of some of the epistemological arguments that we're making? That is to say, how like our commitment to these kind of evidentiary arguments and our effort to say those are the basis for our expertise, I think create kind of social barriers at times to our ability to engage with other communities. Because whether we like it or not, what we're trying to do is tell someone that what they know isn't legitimate knowledge. And I think that anyone who starts a conversation that says what you know is not legitimate knowledge isn't probably in a particularly good place to listen to that. And I can't remember, one of your Patreon, one of your patrons here had a really nice phrase or a really nice statement. Critical thinking and teaching students to evaluate evidence with care should be the mission. And I think a lot of what I'm asking is that's all we're kind of asking people to do, which means not just reading the evidence that we dig up in our trenches or the evidence that we discover in our fields, but also listening to the communities that we have an ethical obligation to engage with, whether they're communities in the present or communities in the past, and listening critically to what they're saying, not just to find new ways to tell them that they're wrong, but in order to frankly learn from them. Like
so
what comes down to. I think one of your guys, John Apple, was saying that he's a sci-fi writer, right? This is a great example of way in which like pseudo-archaeology and sci-fi have this kind of point of intersection, right? Why is sci-fi useful to us? It's because like this is why do guys like Jeff Vandermeer's, like one of my great examples, is why are we interested in his weird science, right? It's because he makes arguments that suspend the rules of science. And he makes these arguments as a way to challenge us to work outside of these epistemological shackles, in part because guys like Vandermeer aren't convinced that we're going to science ourselves out of these problems, that we're not going to just evidence ourselves out of these problems.
I think you're
done.
right.
I'm sorry, Clint. I kept interrupting.
No, you're fine. You're fine. What do you mean? You were? I was trying to interrupt you, and you wouldn't let me.
Sorry, man.
So, in my mind, let's go back to pick on John Apple again. This was something he put way up in the chat that I kind of liked, which is that, like, look, we need a lot of different approaches and tactics. And this has actually been one of my constant refrains, particularly when I go and speak to my academic colleagues at like universities and I talk about my experiences engaging with pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology, is like, I think that really we should all be speaking up and approaching it in all of our different ways, not just pseudoarchaeology and science, but public engagement in general. And so I think that there's, without a doubt, what you are advocating for, which is a kind of two-way communication street, where we communicate, we listen, and we engage in that kind of way. I think that that works really well in person, right? When you are in person doing community engagement, whether it's in a museum, in a lab, on a site, whatever. I've done it a whole lot of times. There's in a classroom. It's very much a two-way street. We can learn and we can listen. We can also explain what we have, and we can have a very reasonable conversation, right? But one of the other things I've learned is that the online world is a very different game. In the online world, the way that things work, you very rarely have a productive exchange. Most of the time, people are interested in just dunking on one another. That is, and so if you do not realize that when you engage with somebody that their goal is to dunk and not have an actual conversation, well, then you are now all of a sudden at a disadvantage. Another thing that we need to realize is that in the online world, that parasocial relationships develop. That's why we have influencers and micro celebrities and YouTubers and podcasters and whatnot. And so I think we need to embrace this kind of multiple approaches and tactics when we try to engage with the public. I certainly fully agree with you that there is room for a two-way street, learning from different communities, communicating with them, and we absolutely need to engage and promote that type of public engagement. But when we think about the online world, I think that's not nearly as effective. I think we need to embrace the influencer economy and the way that the algorithms work to also have a toehold in YouTube, social media, podcasting, and whatnot, where we have to acknowledge that it's not ever going to be a two-way street. It simply is not. The chat that we have going on that we've been replying to, we're very selective in what we reply to. This is very much a parasocial relationship between me and people who subscribe to me. You're now engaging in it and whatnot. And so we need to recognize these contexts and recognize that there's room for very, very many different approaches, and we should be approaching this in different ways, and we should be supportive in general of each other who are trying to engage with the public in all of our different ways. Because I've gotten a lot of critique too. People are like, there should only be one way to do this. And I'm like, no, fuck you. If we're all doing the same thing, that's not going to be effective. We each reach different audiences in different ways. So what I want to do is I want to empower students. I want to empower colleagues to feel comfortable to take their own approaches and use their own voice in their own ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to disagree with there other than the idea that, like,
God damn it.
No, I mean, other than the idea that, like, yeah, we should model better behavior on social media, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I've learned stuff on social media all the time. Like, people say things that are, maybe they're trying to dunk, but like, whatever. Sometimes you learn, like, you learn things from people trying to dunk. Like, I don't know. I don't have, like, I guess maybe my experience in social media has, like, obviously is somewhat different than yours in that I have like 700 followers and you have like 70,000 followers. But like, I'm never, I don't know. I guess I'm just never too jaded to give up. Like, I'm going to model like reasonable discourse. I'm going to, push back against things that I think are nonsense, whether they're coming from you or coming from, some racist grifter. I'm going to like try to communicate with people, whether they're you or a racist grifter. And I'm going to try to like meet people where they are. I think that's like kind of a crucial model for archaeology. And actually, I think it's central to how the discipline has developed over the last, disciplines developed over the last 50 years. I think it just means greater patience. It means greater tolerance. It means more investment in modeling this kind of mutuality, the kind of pluralistic ways in which knowledge is produced. Whether it's through public archaeology formally, whether it's through, the formal processes whether it's through the formal processes of consultation, whether it's through these kinds of conversations, whether it's like taking people seriously on social media, even when they're just trying to be dicks. And I think that, like, we can push back on stuff. I think it's safe within archaeology to push back on stuff like the Pseudoarchaeology podcast network dude was saying that evidence always wins. I think that's fine, except that I'm not really sure that's true. Like, I don't know as if evidence
I think
always
in today's world, I think it's oftentimes not true. Here's Andrew's point here.
Yeah. I don't think evidence always wins. And I think that's like a super important thing for us to remember, is that most of our lives are are grounded in decisions that aren't evidence. I tell my students this all the time. Like, the most important things we do in our lives are things like, oh, I fell in love with my wife. Like, there's no evidence for my love. Like, there's no like love. Like, no one sits there with like some weird chart saying, oh, my love is 6.83 and 6.8, that's marrying level, right? Like, most of our like spiritual lives, like that can provide us with tremendous meaning, right? Which can provide us with tremendous solace when times are bad, that we can, find ways to share joy as communities. Like, there's no evidence for that. Like, what do you want? Like 2,000 years worth of efforts to try to prove 10,000 years of efforts to try to prove evidence for supernatural existence or whatever. And I think if we try to argue, like, whatever, like every 14-year-old in the world tries to argue against the existence of God, all you're left with is a desiccated view of humanity. Like, all you're doing is tearing humans apart, right? Like, that's crazy, right? Like, no one thinks evidence always wins. In fact, I'd argue in most cases, evidence always loses, because it's not the most important things to us.
We definitely need to get you and Andrew on here together.
And by engaging with like pseudoarchaeologists, it reminds us of that. It reminds us that guys like Sun Ra were like struggling to deal with the great failed promise of the second half of the 20th century, that African Americans, not Sun Ra, notably, went and fought in the Second World War and came back. They went and fought in the First World War, and they came back and found that their social condition hadn't changed. That they came back to a U.S. where we continued to build more and more complex arguments, anchoring the experience of white people in the New World, with European traditions, and that African Americans didn't have access to that kind of cultural connection because of the injustice and the trauma of the Middle Passage, and realizing that they're trying to like piece together intergenerational existence in ways that are going to be increasingly relevant in the 21st century as we deal with what some scholars are calling like another great age of migrations. Like, when some Swedes or Scandinavians in central Minnesota like fabricate the Kensington runestone, we could say that they're doing it because of the grift. There's no doubt that there is grift involved, but they're speaking to something. They're speaking to a sense of displacement that I think we're only going to encounter more and more frequently moving forward. The reason why Jeff Vandermeer's books are important.
To be honest, I think that this is what's valuable, is we need to recognize the ways in which pseudoarchaeologists tap into this kind of emotional approach to the world, because and like, people critique.
But I would take out the emotional. I would take out the emotional, because I think that relies then on this like dichotomy between the rational and the emotional that for the last 80 years we've worked to, last 150 years we've worked to eliminate, right? Like, no one buys that shit anymore. Like, no one's peddling that.
I disagree. No,
Who's peddling
disagree.
that?
I think everybody.
What?
What are you talking about? People don't see the difference between emotions and rational thinking. Everybody sees that. Well,
isn't this the entire point of Freud? I think it's the entire point of Freud. I'm pretty sure this is the entire point of Freud.
I think a lot of what you're the one who went there and said, there's no evidence for your love of your wife. It's based on my feelings. So clearly you do separate out rational thinking from feelings. You even use that argument to me, just like,
that's different.
Look, I might have had 2 shots and half a beer, but I'm paying attention to what you're saying, Bill. Don't give me this shit.
That's different. That's different. That's the argument that evidence it always wins, is what I'm trying to say. Is that there are no evidence for most of these things, but they are every bit. But we all accept that love is real, right? Unless you're totally.
But we can also see the difference between logic and emotion. We can actually discern the difference in our own behavior, our own decisions, our own thinking between something like rational thinking and emotional appeal. And so I guess what I'm trying to say...
Logic is a formal system, right?
Sometimes.
Logic is a formal system.
I think you're being a little academic about it. I think to most lay
I think that's the
people,
definition of logic, is that it's a formal system of, right?
again, I think to most lay people, logic is not that. Logic
Oh,
is
I
just
got
sort of
busted for
thinking through.
rambling. Now I feel bad.
Bill is always
Oh,
rambling since I first met him. Um,
I'm discursive.
it's been nearly 20 minutes of 20 years of rambling. But no, my point is I think that you're right. I think there is something that pseudoarchaeologists do that we need to learn from, and which is how to think through how to appeal to the public. You know, what I've done at this point a year and a half of reasonably regular YouTubing, and one of the things I've learned is that yeah, when I'm a little too scholarly, public doesn't click. They don't watch my videos, right? And so thinking through how to actually appeal to a broader public to get to hit those heartstrings that actually get people interested in listening to us is something we should think about learning without a doubt, because I think that that's really important. We are all, as you just put it, a little too discursive. We're all a little too both sidesy and nuanced. And I think we still need to model that nuance. I still think we need to be academics and scientists and scholars because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to share that kind of perspective with the public when we go to the public. But at the same time, we need to learn how to give that out in the right dose, maybe, if you see what I mean. Sometimes we need to just speak clearly and we need to appeal to mystery and to those kind of emotional things, because that's how we get people interested so that they do listen to us so that they can take their medicine with their chocolate cake, if you see what I
Yeah,
mean. The chocolate
this
cake
is like,
is you're going to learn the mysteries of the universe. The medicine is we're going to give it to you in a slightly nuanced fashion.
yeah, I love this, right? Because this the when you hang out, if we had a dozen archaeologists on here, at least 8 of them would say, yeah, the first books I read that talked about archaeology were pseudo archaeology books, right? That this is what like hooked us in, right? Like I remember reading Van Daniken as like a 12-year-old or whatever and being like, whoa, this is wild. Which didn't mean I immediately became, some believer in ancient aliens. That came much later in my life. But after listening to very many Sun Ra albums. But this is why pseudoarchaeology is always going to have an edge, right? Like pseudoarchaeology is going to defy expectations. It's going to it isn't constrained by certain traditions of knowledge making, right? It has expansiveness to it. This is why one of your commentators was talking about Jeff Vandermeer. This is why Vandermeer uses fiction to explore these like ideas that are really complex, right? And it isn't really about saying this is responding to one of his comments that whether facts are real or not. But like you read the Sudden Reach trilogy, for example, and there really aren't facts there. That's the point. Like this is a group that is struggling with the real fabric of reality, right? Of course, it's fiction. We could say, it's fiction. But that doesn't mean it's meaningless, right? This is kind of what we're saying. We're always going to lose then when confronting pseudoarchaeology, because if you listen to Sun Ra's Atlantis, it's going to take you to a place that, the latest Near Eastern archaeology magazine, as I advertise for my professional organization, is not going to take you, even if this is pretty damn cool. Like this is their effort at a public outreach publication. This is the American Societies of Overseas Research, their publication. But something like this, which is Conjunctions, which is a literary magazine out of New York, is going to take you different places, and we're going to be at a disadvantage forever. Whether we make up for that doing the hard work you're doing, which is engaging in polemic and attracting people who enjoy that kind of like pugilistic, that kind of agonistic kind of conversation, or whether you do it the way I'm going to try to do it, which is inviting people to like listen to some Sun Ra, to like think about like what it means for this like crazy dude from like Chicago to end up in Egypt in 1971. And having kind of quasi mystical experiences. We're all going to the same place, or we're all headed in the same direction, even if we don't end up in the same place.
Yeah, I think so. So, all right, let's move toward. Do you have any final points before we move to audience questions?
Nope, I'm cool. I think your last word was pretty spot on.
Wait, let me see. You sent me some bullet points. Are there any ones that we wanted to cover?
I think we've hit on most of them.
Yeah. All right, people. Ask some questions for me and Bill. Let me get my little question thing up. 1 second. I have a little question thing. There we go. See, I'm all ready for this stuff. So I saw a question above. Where did it go? Aha. Sheila Horseman asks, Bill and Flint, in your experience, are the majority of pseudoarchaeology fans North Americans, as I find in my Facebook groups to be the case?
I think that we are more. How about this, Flint? See if you agree. I think we're more willing to brand North Americans pseudo-archaeologists than people elsewhere, in part because we don't have the kind of because we tend to be more sensitive toward other cultures.
Yeah, I think we're also just generally more in North American culture, being North Americans ourselves. So we see it more closely. But if you look at some of the major proponents of pseudoarchaeology, many of them are Europeans: Graham Hancock, Eric von
Yeah, that's true.
Daniken, you know,
Yep.
most of the more famous
And
ones.
hey,
And
can I pitch?
yeah,
Can I pitch something I wrote recently?
yeah,
Um,
sure.
one of a recent article that that just was published earlier this year is with a buddy of mine called Kostis Karelis. Do you know Kostis?
Yeah,
Your
yeah, I know
paths ever crossed?
Costas. Yeah,
Yeah, he's a great guy. He and I wrote
he
this
is a
piece
great
called
guy.
Dream. He and I wrote this piece called Dream Archaeology, and the basis of Dream Archaeology is Anastasios Orlandos, this like preeminent Greek archaeologist, went to a village in central Greece, Daphnusia, right there on the Aegean, because a woman had a dream that an archaeologist, yeah, thank you, had a dream, and they dug where the dream directed, and they found an early Christian basilica. And this story, this is just one of a kind of story, right, that occurs again and again. Wildly, right? There's this guy Angelos Tenagras, who's one of the great parapsychologists. He's a Freudian parapsychologist. Works in Greece between the wars, lives in Greece between the wars, and is attempting to establish evidence for parapsychological powers within Greek folk culture. Like he wants to understand how, using parapsychological reasoning, how the evil eye works, right? This guy becomes a kind of patron of archaeology. He hangs out with all these big time Greek archaeologists, right? Who in fact dedicate their works to him. One of the earliest works on the surveys, the archaeology of Athens in the 1920s, is dedicated to this guy, Angelos Tenagras, right? So, and Tenagras and Orlandos, and there are other examples, right, within a Greek tradition, show us that the lines between pseudo-archaeology and disciplinary archaeology in cross-cultural contexts become harder and harder to discern, right? Obviously, the idea of a dream leading one to find an archaeological artifact goes back to, you know, Roman times. And of course, it's built into Greek culture through Byzantine traditions, right? The discovery of the true cross comes as a result of a dream, right? Helena had a dream which led her to the true cross. Then there's saints, like all through the Middle Byzantine period, are having dreams that have helped, that often lead to them finding early Christian remains, right? Which is one of the ways in which Middle Byzantine communities established historical continuity over the course of the disruptions that occurred in the 8th and 9th centuries, right? So these things then are being used when in Greece after the Megali catastrophe, right? After the exchange of populations, in order to try to find new ways in which to establish cultural context. Again, it goes back to one of your commentators saying, it's about reading critically, right? It's about reading contextually, things that archaeologists privilege. It's about reading in a culturally aware way to understand how these traditions contribute not just to the development of archaeological traditions in a particular place, but to disciplinary traditions that go beyond that allow us to be a more pluralistic, a more responsive, a more responsible, and a more kind of two-way street kind of discipline, without necessarily giving up our kind of privileged way of thinking, which I think you've made a very strong case for, that our expertise we should keep, in a lockbox. But that shouldn't mean that we don't put it under our jacket at times when we want to have a conversation with someone who's going to think very differently from us.
Yeah, and I also think, as I've always said, I mean, from the very beginning of this conversation, part of my issue with pseudoarchaeology is not what people believe; it's the antagonistic way that they approach archaeologists and scholars. And so, an example of how we can see exceptions to this is an early Egyptologist. Her works showed up in a wide variety of publications. She helped direct projects, including the Sphinx, the excavation of the Sphinx in the 30s. She was largely responsible for many of the illustrations in some of these books. And she worked in Abydos for a long time, was Dorothy Louise Eady, who was British, but she ended up, she believed that she was a reincarnated individual from the ancient Egypt. And so she went by Seti. We can zoom in here. And, she worked very, very closely for a number of decades, like 50 years, 40 years, something like that, with Egyptologists and archaeologists, some of whom scoffed at her beliefs that she was a reincarnated individual from ancient Egypt, but they still respected her because she knew what the fuck she was doing, and she collaborated really closely with everybody, and she tried to develop mutual respect between her sort of views on ancient Egypt and whatnot, based on her spiritual beliefs, and the actual science that was happening around her. And so, I think that this is something that's important to recognize is, at least to me, I can't speak for all my colleagues, but for me, my issue as pseudoarchaeologist is the antagonism. It's not anybody's beliefs. If you want to work with me, fucking work with me. I've trained a French hairdresser in the Wiener Lab in Athens, right? In the American school, right? She would come in every week, twice a week, to work with me on animal bones. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your beliefs are. If you want to work with us and have a community project where we are learning from each other, joking around, having conversations, that's fine. If you believe that you're a reincarnated ancient Greek, that's fine. I'm not going to shit on you. I don't care. I don't want to get into fights just because we have different belief systems. I have zero problem with that. My issue is when you start going out there and telling the world that archaeologists are all lying. Because most of my colleagues, you included, are mostly really well-intentioned. Now, we can find many examples, and we should call out the bad actors in our field, but the vast majority of scholars are just trying to study the past because they're interested in it, obsessed with it.
Another good
that's
example.
Just all they're trying to do.
Another good example is Mark Lenner, right? Here's a dude who is a Casian, right? He published a book on cases readings that deal with ancient Egypt, like the ARE, which is cases kind of legacy organization, help funded him going on his first digs. And by the late 80s, early 90s, he's actually, it doesn't really work out very well. He still is an adherent and a supporter of that organization. I mean, this organization, right, also helped fund Zahi Hawass, right? When he first came to Penn, when he first came to the US, right? They helped support him. And do their ideas jive with what Case was doing? For those of you who don't know, he's one of the great wellheads of pseudoarchaeology. He had would go into this kind of trance state, and he would and he claimed to be Ra, who is I can't remember, some dynasty Egyptian, right? And then talked a bunch of stuff about ancient Egypt that in the 1950s, there was an interest in attempting to understand if this was real or not, right? What's going on here? And by the 1980s and 90s, it had largely been debunked, as they say. But some of these people who followed Case are if not well respected, at least legitimate colleagues, right? I think no one has a beef with with these dudes. I mean, they may have beef with them, but they don't have a beef with them over their adherence to kind of archaeological standards. So just to confirm what you're saying, I think this is absolutely true.
Yeah, so I've been trying to get in touch with Mark Lehner. I got to send him another email because I would like to know more about that past for a number
Yeah,
of
I would
different
too, man.
reasons.
I would
Yeah,
too.
yeah, and so like
Like, I,
there's a for well, one of the things is, so I found on archive.org a number of talks that Edward Casey's children gave. His two sons led
do you pronounce it
his what is
Casey or Case?
I
I don't
I
know.
don't know actually. Yeah, I don't
Yeah, I
know.
don't know either.
Um,
But you knew who I
but
was
either
talking
way,
about.
like yeah, I did. I've done my research too, Bill.
No, I just
But
didn't know if I pronounced it
I
right.
thought it was kind of interesting to hear them talk about some of the research that they funded, like into the
Yeah,
sphinxes and stuff like that,
yeah, yeah,
because like they were proud that they funded this stuff, but at the same time they presented some of it in some not as antagonistic as like a Graham Hancock, Jimmy Corsetti type, but in a kind of antagonistic way. And so,
yeah,
I actually I really like to understand better the relationship between that association, the Association for Research of Enlightenment, I think it was called,
yeah.
and Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner and some of the research into the Sphinx in Giza. I'm working on a video on Graham Hancock's sort of prehistory, and there's some interesting stuff there with some of the stuff he's said
I think
about
they've
that
had Hancock, right?
association.
Yeah, they've had Hancock.
Well,
I think he
he's been
came and
very
spoke.
critical of them as well. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
there's some weird shit. I'm not going to spill my beans right now because this is saving up for a bombshell video that I've been working on for way too long. But like there's some weird stuff there. And I don't know the details. This is all from the early to mid 90s. And
yep,
like, I was a little kid then. I don't fucking know. So like, I would like to think through more on that, but I don't know. There is this interesting relationship there though with that association between pseudoarchaeology and archaeology that has provided some beneficial stuff, also provided some less beneficial stuff. So yeah, I'd be interested to know more.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's
Um
like the best case
ha-
scenario, right? In some
yeah,
ways, that they're
yeah.
like, yeah,
I mean, like I said, I just think that look, part of my issue is I'm also working on a video on the top like 5 tells of pseudoscience, right? How can you immediately tell something is pseudoscience? And to be honest, my number one is that kind of antagonism, that kind of stigmatized rhetoric, which is they're canceling me. And it's just like, the thing is as soon as you say that, you sell books, you get clicks, you get all this, especially in today's
but we're
world.
doing it too, man. We're doing it too. Like that's
As
why
we
that's
should,
like
because it works.
my
As
number
we
one
should.
my number
As we
one
should.
opposition to debunking is because it comes out from this place of like, of like persecution. So this is one of the reasons why I've like pushed back against it a little bit, is because we can't go and criticize them for engaging in these kind of polemical practices when then we're leveraging those very polemical practices to advance our own story. I think that I'm willing to tolerate your argument that you need to do this in order to get the spotlight back on, as you affectionately call it, real archaeology. I'll tolerate that. Like, it's not my favorite argument, but okay, fine. As long as you recognize that there are going to be people like me who are going to attempt to model a different approach.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, I think the
And
best
part of the
way to
reason
go
I'm
about public engagement is having multiple approaches. So I'm all for that. I think that if anything, we need to be. That's why I have you on right now, because I agree with you on a lot of things, but I also disagree with you on some things. That's why we've been, doing our little sparring. But I think that's key. I think that the best way to engage the public with archaeology is to show them that we have so many different approaches, right? And that is the best way to get different people interested. So if
and we can
anything, my
have
big
debates that don't involve me somehow saying that you're lying, and you not somehow telling
yes.
me that I'm lying, right? Which means like I still disagree with
You
you
know,
every bit as
I didn't
fiercely.
want to call any of these fuckers liars. I tended to actually give them all the benefit of the doubt that they believe their shit until they started blatantly lying about me. As
Look,
soon
man,
as that starts, you know what? Fuck you. I can see you're lying. I can call it out because I can see it step by step. Your
yeah,
lies
look,
are not really about archaeology, the ones that are blatant. Your lies are about archaeologists is actually, it's one of my things with Hancock. I get asked by journalists all the time, do you think Hancock believes in what he sells? And to be frank, Hancock, if he does not believe in it, is really good. He's really, really good at stating this stuff consistently, so that if you want to catch him in a lie, you can. I've read Hancock's stuff. I've listened to so much of what he said. He is so fucking consistent, right? Except with one thing, what he says about archaeologists. That's where you can see him spout lies. And so it's like they're obvious, overt lies where he changes what he says and he misremembers his own experiences with archaeologists. And it's just like, that's where you can catch him in the lies, not in what he says about archaeology, but in what he says about archaeologists. And so, I don't want to call these people liars. I'd rather just share archaeology. I went on Rogan just to say, hey, this is what we do. This is why we believe what we believe. This is the evidence. I didn't want to get into this antagonism, but they fucking went after me. And you know what? Fuck off. Sorry, I've had a week. And I'm going to have some bombshells coming out soon because I've had a week.
That's fine, man. I'm not. I don't have a beef with that. I think we can do better, but whatever. I'm always gonna. I'm not suggesting that I'm.
We're human too, though.
Or
we're
yeah, human. That's exactly where I was going. I'm not gonna say I'm morally or ethically superior or anything like that. But I think we can both probably agree that like one of the powers that archaeology has, and one of the things that discipline has worked really hard at over the last, I think again our careers, right, has been like, how do we do better? How do we engage with even communities that aren't gonna be happy to see us show up? And I think that's, it's a work in progress, man. It takes a lot of tolerance, and you've stuck your head in the mouth of the lion, and I think you've largely been, a model citizen, a model representative of our discipline. And so I've always appreciated that. But we also have to be a little careful that we don't do the same thing they do, which is like trying to find Hancock lying is then gives credence to a kind of method that leads them to try to find us lying. And then
they're already doing that, is what I'm trying to say. They're already all doing
but we shouldn't. But we don't return fire the same way, right? Like we should.
Sometimes we need to call a spade, man. Like if somebody is lying about me, what am I supposed to do? Especially somebody that has a huge audience. What am I supposed? I'm supposed to just accept lies about me? No. Why should I? Why should we accept it when people lie about the management of sites? When they're lying about how we manage sites? And that actually has a real impact then on the politics in these other regions and the way that the sites end up getting managed. And so, and a negative impact. And so, we need to, I actually think we need to be speaking up as loudly as we can, and all of us in a multivocal sort of way. I don't think there's any right approach other than we need to stop being fearful of speaking up. And I get it. There's a lot of reasons to be fearful of speaking up. There's armies of trolls out there. There's a political situation that is very kind of freaky right now. And, there's all sorts of disincentives to speaking up. But if we don't speak up, we're screwed, is how I see it.
All right. Do we have any more questions? We can agree to disagree.
We haven't seen many. Yeah, we can agree to disagree. I haven't seen it. They're just chatting among themselves. Charles, my good old buddy, my grad school buddy. Yeah, they are. It's Alepha, Charles. But yeah, no, they're just chatting among. They're responding to things we're saying, but I haven't seen many questions. So let's call it. Dr. Bill Caraher, you can consider yourself owned and served. No, I'm joking. It was a very good chat, and I hope to have you back on, and we'll chat about some other fun things at some point. Maybe North Dakota oil wells or something like that.
Excellent. We should.
Yeah, that would be fun. So go check out Bill Caraher and his blog, The Archaeology of Mediterranean Societies. I think I had that up somewhere.
Archaeology of the Mediterranean World.
Oh, fuck. See, I've had too many beers.
It's Friday.
Here we go.
It's like not what's
Here's
it like
here
after 9 o'clock on Friday there? You're still
after 8
upright?
now.
After 8.
Yeah.
All right.
And
Hey, there's
yeah,
Jody.
so thanks everybody for tuning in. It was a really fun conversation. And make sure to like, to subscribe. Join me on Patreon or as a channel member for more content. And yeah, peace out all. Have a good weekend. I'll probably do a live stream Sunday, and I have a new video